Martin says, I wish you luck. I kind of feel that way too. You know, you come to worship on Sunday morning, you expect to hear the good news, and what do you hear? Weeping and gnashing of teeth, exactly. I am Reverend Jonathan New. I am your Associate Conference Minister for Stewardship and Financial Development with the Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ, and I bring you greetings on this morning from the 350 plus other congregations of the Massachusetts Conference with whom you are in partnership in mission and ministry, whether you know it or not. There will be a time a little bit later to talk to me a bit more about that partnership, what it's all about, how you support it, what is accomplished through it, and I look forward to that. But actually I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about anxiety to begin with. I don't know about the rest of you, but this is a time when it seems to be a great deal of anxiety about a lot of things. And so that is why I am very grateful to have experienced just the opposite not too long ago. To experience absolute peace and tranquility and serenity. It came when my 21-year-old daughter announced her plans to spend this past summer away at an internship. And my wife said to me, with a kind of disgusted smirk on her face, "Well, it looks like you're off the hook again." I had this overwhelming sense of relief. You see, because a few years ago, I drew the short straw and won the honor to guide my daughter, Ellie, through one of those most American rites of passage, learning to drive. Learning to drive. Well, since then, circumstances have contrived in such a way that I have managed to squeak out of this responsibility one way or another, and I've experienced every single time this sense of tranquility of being let off the hook. But at the time, when I drew that short straw, I felt something different. I felt a mounting sense of terror rising in me, especially as I recalled teaching our oldest daughter, Sarah, how to drive. I remember sitting in the passenger seat, calmly giving advice. The picture of serenity, think Buddha. And inside, of course, for any of you who have done this, you know what was actually going on. I was a complete wreck. Not because Sarah was a reckless speed demon. In fact, it was really just the opposite. And I remember at the time commiserating with another parent who was teaching his son to drive, who had a similar problem, being tentative beyond belief. He told me this story once about how the first time they drove on the interstate, and the kid takes the entrance ramp for the interstate and slows down to merge, slows down a bit more, and finally comes to a complete stop as the cars are going by. And he's looking over, and next to him, the dad sees multiple opportunities to pull out onto the highway. But still, the cars are speeding by, and you can imagine what's happening behind the kid. There's a line forming there, right? And then the honks start to sound. And still, the kid is completely frozen. Finally, the dad, till this moment, the model of patience, again, Buddha, right? He sees these multiple opportunities for the kid to pull off onto the highway. He finally shouts in frustration, "Son, the sign says yield, not give up." Well, worry is something we all experience, and worry can indeed be a motivator. and not a paralyzer, a motivator. But sometimes it is indeed paralyzing, and in today's parable, the slaves have some reason to be worried. I mean, just look at the end of this parable. You can see why. Their master entrusts them with his property while he's away. Now, I don't know how many of you are up on your on the monetary system of the Holy Roman Empire of the time, but I had to look this up, and I discovered that the talent was the largest denomination of the Roman Empire. In fact, the talent was a very large denomination. In fact, it was very large. A silver ingot weighing over 100 pounds, worth what a day laborer might earn in 15 years or more of service. So this is an enormous sum of money. Just one talent. So we can sympathize with that one slave, that third slave, who just buries the talent in the ground. And in fact, Jewish law of the day said he could do that and not be held responsible. That would be an okay way to handle it, at least by the law. But what he finds out is that there is indeed greater risk that he didn't understand. The master, it turns out, gave his money to him to be its steward, not its guard, to invest his assets. And by definition, for any of you who are acquainted with investment, investment always means some level of risk. To have doubled the money entrusted to them, the servants had to risk losing some, if not all, of what had been given them. And understanding that not risking these assets would be irresponsible, according to the master, and understanding that, they're transformed. They're transformed from mere slaves into trusted stewards who would also abide in their master's joy. Okay, now at this point I need to ask a question. How many of you serve on the finance committee or the investment committee of this church? Any of you? Okay, at least one person here. I need to talk to you, just as an aside, and just say, unfortunately, I can't say that this parable is told to promote lucrative financial investments. I can't say that, okay? Jesus is telling this story because he wants to help us understand the kingdom of God, the realm of God's love. But Jesus does promote faithful stewardship. And he also, here's the good news, does promote investment, right? So how might we be stewards, really? That's the question that comes to me as I hear this story. How might we be stewards, and how might we invest? Well, like all of those talents, our world and our lives, the time that we have, our abilities, our wealth, all that is a part of us has been entrusted to us. And Jesus urges us to overcome our worries and invest them so that there might be an incredible return on investment. The establishment of God's realm of love. Now, you probably didn't know you were going to get a stewardship sermon this morning. And I just want to acknowledge something. Most people, most of us, hear the word stewardship and we think, well, stewardship is that moment when church leaders are trying to get money to pay the bills. That's kind of what it's been reduced to. And I will say, in some churches, Stewardship and the process of stewardship among church leaders appears to have the idea that it's the church's way of getting money from people's pockets into the church's coffers. So I just want to acknowledge that stewardship in some places has become tainted somewhat. So we need to back away from those things and understand stewardship in its fullest understanding as we understand it here in the gospel. Stewardship, it turns out, is the fearless investment of our gifts on behalf of the gospel, the good news of God's love. And that kind of stewardship always involves risk, because the proper use of our gifts, loving other people, always involves risk. So think back to that moment when I was driving around with my daughter, Sarah, practice driving, and I was afraid. I was afraid of the fact that she might cross the center line and run us into a car or run us off the side of the road, but actually, when I think back to that time, I know that there was an even greater risk. And that is in that charged moment together, where anything could happen and anything might be said, our relationship was at risk. And I knew that. And that is, I don't know for the rest of you, but that is part of what made that moment so terror-raising for me. I didn't want our relationship broken, but it always involves risk, this loving. So, the true business of the church, it turns out, is always risky business. But there are some spiritual dangers too. For example, burying our treasure in a miser's hole, denying its power to bring others to wholeness, worrying to the point of paralysis, failing to proclaim and embody this transformative good news by risking what has been put into our hands, possibly losing it all, so that we might discover the life-changing power only to be found by risking. Thomas Carlyle, the poet, writes, "It is good to use best china, treasured dishes, the most genuine goblets, or the oldest tablecloth. There is risk, of course, every time we use anything, or anyone shares an inmost mood or moment or a fragile cup of revelation. But not to touch, not to handle, not to employ the available artifacts of being. That is the quiet crash, the deadly catastrophe where nothing is enjoyed or broken, or spoken or spilled, or stained or mended, where nothing is ever lived, loved, pored over, laughed over, wept over, lost, or found." The world tells us that if we give something, we ought to get something back. The world tells us that. And that is why I love one of the most countercultural aspects of worship, something that we've already done here this morning, and that is passing the offering plate. You may know that 19th century churches rented pews in order to raise funds for the church. I don't even know. That may even have been a practice here. I don't know. But it was true in many, many churches. And the story is told of Mark Twain, who encountered this practice once, was up north and visited a church and made the mistake of taking the first vacant pew. And partway during the service, the story goes, an indignant parishioner passed him a note. You can imagine the note comes down the line, right? Finally gets to Mark Twain, and he receives it, and he unfolds it, and he reads, "You are sitting in my pew, for which I pay $50 a year." And Twain looks at it for a little bit, and he flips the piece of paper over and fishes in his pocket and pulls out a little stub of pencil and writes his own note, folds it up, hands it back, it gets passed back down the line, gets back to that indignant parishioner who unfolds it, opens it up, and unfolds it and reads, "You are paying too much." Well, Twain might have been critiquing the poor quality of the sermon. I don't know. That's possible. But I suspect there's something else going on here. I suspect that he's using his wit to reveal something, to reveal that we often fall into a particular trap when it comes to our giving and our stewardship and generosity through church. And that is the trap of thinking of our stewardship as paying our way at church, when it is really something else. When it is really an investment that we are choosing to make on behalf of our siblings in the family of God. It's also a moment to show where our heart is with other people. I have a great privilege of being in churches most Sundays, and so my sense of who we are may be a little bit different than yours. I don't know. I'd love to talk about this later with some of you. I look at every church distributed throughout the Mass Conference, and indeed in other denominations and beyond Massachusetts and other places, as a mission outpost, a place, a concrete place, where the love of God is being proclaimed and made real. That's how I think of you. I look across this congregation and I see power here to make the world that God calls us to help make it. A mission outpost. And so, therefore, I encourage every church to think of that thing that seems like a necessary evil, the church budget, right, as something else. As a mission spending plan. Your plan for how you are going to make God's love and justice real in the coming year. You're going to set money aside for special mission projects. Don't stop doing that. That's great. Don't stop doing what you do through the Topsfield Fair and all the mission giving that happens through that. Don't stop doing that. But when you think about your budget, I hope that you will think about it as your plan for advancing God's mission by dispersing God's transformative power wherever it is needed. By everything that you give, by everything that you do as church, and indeed simply by being. When I first began in ministry, and I'm coming up on the 20th anniversary of my ordination, I absolutely thought I knew everything. I know enough now to know that I only know a bit about what ministry actually is. I know enough to know that I'm still learning. Today, I am absolutely certain why being church matters. And I can sum it up with one word, and that word is lasagna. Lasagna. Some of you already know where I'm going with this. Back in 2004, I was pastoring a small church in Vermont, central Vermont, and life was going along swimmingly for me and for my wife and my two daughters. This is well before I had to teach either of them to drive, But life was going along very smoothly, and things were going well with the church and our lives. And then suddenly that world was completely turned upside down when I was diagnosed with leukemia. And I'm perfectly fine, and this is not a story about my leukemia. This is a story, in fact, about the church, with a capital C, the church. For months, that little church kept our household going. You've probably heard that stories of when there's a fire, people form a bucket brigade to put out the fire. I like to think that people in my church community formed a lasagna brigade for us because we saw a lot of it. You know what I'm talking about. Now, some of that lasagna was not the best, okay? But being on the receiving end of the lasagna brigade was life-changing for me. Our church members did all kinds of things for us. They babysat our kids. They sent us notes and messages and cards. They stacked firewood for us. They prayed for us. They got our kids to where they needed to get to. They delivered groceries, and on and on and on. And then as I began to recover, they celebrated with us, prayed for us throughout that whole time. And as things got back to normal, rejoiced with us. That little church did what churches do best and often take for granted. They surround those in need with the love and care required to be whole again in every way. Through lasagna, I like to say, I got a taste of the good news. And I got a foretaste of the realm of love that God intends every person to know. You all have the power to do that. Believe it or not. It's already happening. It has already happened, and it will happen. And I want you to take that seriously, because churches embracing this wider understanding of mission, that all they do and all they are and all they give are tied to God's mission, well, it turns out those churches tend to be the churches that by every measure are most vital. They know who they are. And they know that what they do will make a difference to people who yearn to experience God's good news. They risk investment in God's realm of love. Remembering God's love isn't prudent but extravagant. And ours should be too. As you all struggle with whatever stewardship means, may mean, is, indeed there are bills to be paid, I hope that you will yet remember the power that you have in your hands to make the kind of difference that God calls us to make, and indeed to make the kind of unique, transformative difference that you all discern needs to happen and can happen in and through this special congregation. You are a blessing to the world. And so give thanks for that blessing that you are and all that's been entrusted to you. Give thanks to God, because by using those gifts, that is one of the best ways that we send our gratitude back to the one who gives us all. And thereby, may you and all of us discover the joy that can only be found by overcoming fear and by risking all.